My name is Matt Delvecchio, specializing in life transitions, elder care planning, and the senior living industry.
And I'm Corey Sirota, clinical social worker and author of Someone Died, Now What? Coming up on the second half, we're going to be talking as part of our segment on helping moms and dads, which provides guidance and support to the sandwich generation. We are constantly offering interesting and knowledgeable guests covering a huge array of topics to help families cope with the challenges of the aging process. Today is no exception. We are going to tackle the topic of aging in place versus transitioning into a condominium or senior living community. Let's be honest, as our population ages, more and more families are having to deal with caregiving for a loved one. In fact, almost 1 in 4 adults in Canada are considered caregivers. So we're going to dig a little deeper today, and we're going to hear from Matt Delvecchio, who deals with this issue on a daily basis with families. So do I welcome you to Life Unrehearsed, Matt?
Thank you, Corey.
So it's so great. I always love chatting with you. It's fun like this. So let's start with, what are the trends you're seeing out there regarding people aging in place versus moving to a condominium or a senior living community?
Well, let's face it, I think it's only natural. Most people want to stay at home as long as they possibly can. And if I were to say pre-pandemic, I saw a lot more couples or individuals that were either going to be downsizing into a condominium or even proactively going into a nice retirement home, independent living. But since the pandemic started and as it's going on, people are a little more hesitant, perhaps a little more concerned, and therefore the demand for independent living, retirement homes, has decreased considerably. And although the numbers haven't been increasing recently in the last few months as confidence gains a little bit, it's still an issue. But what I'm really seeing is that people are staying at home perhaps even too long. Mm-hmm. So as care levels increase for loved ones at home, I'm seeing a lot of families and individuals and spouses and adult children getting burnt out, really tired, and quite frankly exhausted. And so when they start looking for an alternative, they need a place quickly. It's almost crisis mode.
Yeah.
And so my world these days is a much more crisis reaction, and that's difficult on families.
Without a doubt. So given that, if they're staying at home, I want to know what needs to be in place successfully so that people can be safe at home. And I know you just wrote an article on this very topic, and you talked about 4 different important factors. So I want to address them. Let's start with number 1, safety and security.
Yeah, again, the spirit is, how can we stay at home longer? The term we use is aging in place. Safety and security is absolutely crucial. So, for example, is the living environment safe and secure? Are you living alone, or is there someone that is there with you, your spouse or partner? Little things, but important things. Stairs. Are they becoming an issue, having to navigate stairs? Is the bathroom properly set up? We've talked about slips and falls on our show many times, and it's a lot of it has to do with the bathrooms, and they don't have the grab bars all set up and the rugs that are coming out from under them. Simple things, important things, basic things that we take for granted. Meals and nutrition. Are you going into the fridge and seeing expired food? And no, don't worry, I'm eating properly. And you know that maybe that is not the case. And other things like medication management. Are they taking your meds in the right quantities at the right time?
Okay, so that's one. There's a few more. So what about the appropriate levels of care?
Yeah. So I love to address this important topic because you mentioned at the top, caregivers. Almost 1 in 4 Canadians, think about that, are playing the role of caregivers. Almost 0% have been formally trained. Okay. You know, you're usually thrown into that role of caregivers. So it becomes physically and mentally exhausting. So, for example, if you are helping a loved one getting out of bed, transferring, well, you might not know the skills to lift. Your back is hurting just trying to lift. So that's physical. On the mental part of things, for example, if you're dealing with someone with Alzheimer's and dementia, does the caregiver know the tricks of proper memory care? Do you know how to distract or redirect, deal with aggression, whether it's verbal or physical aggression? And are you able to cope with the questions that never stop, the repeated questions? So, if you visit someone occasionally, you could live that. But if you're living with that person 24/7, it's very difficult to be able to cope with.
So speaking of stress, let's talk about the caregiver stress.
That's one of the third point is the caregiver stress, because too many times the focus is on the person requiring care. And not enough focuses on the caregiver and the stress that they're under day by day. So, it's the typical, airplane
Right.
oxygen.
Yeah.
Put the oxygen mask on yourself. Because God forbid, if something happens to the caregiver, then it's a massive problem.
Gosh. That's right. That's right. So that's the third point. And I know there were 4 that you mentioned. So what about the financial stress?
Yeah, I guess when we're talking about setting yourself up to age at home, this is another important point. Can you financially afford to have your loved one at home? Can you afford to do this? So if you're getting some CLSC help, great. As we all know, our health system is broken. Usually you're not getting enough hours. So what happens? Families have to top that off by hiring private caregivers. It starts to get expensive. And probably the most important point is that some caregivers actually stop their jobs. They have to quit their jobs, or they go on a leave of absence. What happens is they're losing revenue there, and things like, you're going up the corporate ladder and that just stops all of a sudden. And now you have to start over. So these are what we call financial implications. And that needs to be part of the equation as well, if you can properly age at home.
So many things to think about. And here, so we get that, we understand it. So how would you know then that what would be the point that a transition into a senior living community should be considered?
Usually we see, 2 things. First of all, for an individual or a couple, when I say an individual, perhaps you've recently lost your spouse over the last 2, 3, 4 years, and now you're still a homeowner. Or you're a couple and you're just fed up. You see the property taxes going up and the burden of home ownership is becoming too much. So that's a big reason what we see why people are considering a move to a senior living community. And those other factors that I've talked about, if you can't honestly look in the mirror and say, okay, is it safe and secure? Am I able to provide the proper care? Am I not on the verge of a burnout, or my children are they on verges of burnout anxiety? And is it getting too expensive at home? I think these are the reasons when you have to step back and say, okay, maybe it might be time to look for a senior living community.
Fair and all incredibly valid points. That is the voice of Matt Del Vecchio. You're listening to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Corey Sirota, and I'm talking with Matt about the pros and cons of aging in place versus transitioning into a senior community. So I know that this is not an easy question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do families deal with the psychology of a potential transition?
This is, if I were to say, this is probably the hardest part of what our team does and what we try to deal with. Let's face it, there's guilt and there's sometimes denial and not wanting to tackle these difficult challenges. And so I think I always try to suggest taking the emotion out of it. Try to move from an emotional state into a rational state. Now, that's easier said than done. So what we'd like to do is look for some trigger events. For example, is there a hospitalization, or was there a fall that happened? Was there incidents of wandering, maybe not finding where you have to come back? Is the caregiver getting sick more and more and more? And has someone else made a successful transition that you could look at? And if you hear things like a radio interview like this or read it in the news, that's a trigger event that will start a conversation.
I think that's important, starting the conversation. Now, we're going to have to head out to traffic, but when we come back, Matt Del Vecchio from Lianas Senior Transition Services is going to tell us more about what the biggest mistakes people might make when they're looking for the right senior living community, because we don't necessarily know what it is we're supposed to be looking at. And I love that you said newspaper, radio interview, read the articles to help start the conversations, and we're here, you're here, Lianas Senior Services is here to help. So we're going to hear all about that as soon as we come back from the CJAD Traffic Center. I'm Corey Sirota, and I'm talking with Matt Del Vecchio about the pros and cons of aging in place versus transitioning into a senior living community. So I asked you before the traffic, what are the biggest mistakes people make when they're looking for the right seniors community?
I'd like to address this question, Corey, talking to the adult children.
Okay.
Everyone cares for their parents, and you want the best for them. But sometimes when we're visiting retirement homes and residences, they're looking from their eyes, the adult children's eyes, instead of their mom's or dad's eyes. So, for example, it's nice that they have a pool and a gym, and it's good. Wow, that's pretty good.
Right.
And sometimes I ask, when's the last time mom was actually in a pool? And it could be 25, 30,
Right.
40 years. So try to take it from their perspective. and focus on the critical questions. For example, we don't ask enough, what about the continuum of care? You could be independent right now, but you may need some services down the road. We want to minimize transitions. So what about the continuum of care? So another important part is geography. So let me explain. Often I've seen a move to a retirement home because it's geographically closer to the kids and the grandkids.
Okay.
Now, if the care is there and it's the right culture and the environment and the costing and pricing is good, no problem. Do that. But be careful not to fall into the trap of, Ma, come closer to us. The grandkids are going to see you more often. Good thoughts, but guess what? It doesn't happen like that.
Right.
So don't move specifically for geographic reasons. Make sure all the other important factors of why you're moving are in place.
Very, very sage advice. I have to be honest, I'm a little confused about when I think about seniors' residences. How are they categorized?
Yeah, it can be very confusing. If anything, there's been a highlight since the pandemic and all these acronyms and so on. So I'll try to break it down nice and simple. At the highest level of care, we're talking long-term care, LTC, or you and I would know that maybe as nursing homes. In Quebec, they're mostly known as CHSLDs, Centre d'hébergement de soins de longue durée, SLD, that's long-term care, right? So when we talk about long-term care, this is the highest level of care. It's usually more than 3 hours of care. They can go right to palliative care. So there are some private long-term care, but the vast, vast majority are the public residences that we hear about. Those would be the public CHSLDs. The category below that is RPAs. RPAs stand for Résidence Privée pour Aînés. In other words, this can be broken down into independent living and assisted living. And assisted living could be things like helping with dressing and undressing and bathing. Your meals are provided, your laundry and housekeeping. Usually assisted livings can go up to 3 hours of care. Once we go beyond that threshold, now we're truly into long-term care. So I think that's the way to classify the different categories.
So important to make that difference. That is Matt Del Vecchio, and you are listening to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Corey Sirota, and I'm talking with Matt about the pros and cons of aging in place versus transitioning into a senior living community. Cost. Let's talk dollars and cents, Matt. What's that cost going to look like?
Yeah, we talked about, sometimes we want to age at home as long as we can, but sometimes that becomes cost prohibitive, and it may even be less expensive to go into a senior living community. But costs will vary. So I'm going to try to keep it simple as well. For in the public CHSLD, it's the same price for a private room no matter where you are in Quebec. $2,019.30 a month. That's exactly what it costs for public CHSLDs in Quebec. Now, beyond that, if we start looking into the private senior living communities, it can vary all over the place. And why does it vary? 3 important factors. The size of the apartment. Could be a studio, a 1-bedroom, or a 2-bedroom. The amount of care that's required. Maybe some people don't even need any care, totally independent living, or they do need assistance with medication management, dressing, undressing, bathing, etc. And services. Do you get housekeeping, laundry services? Meals would be a service. So once you start up adding size of the apartment, the amount of care, and the meals, it will vary. So we can go into a 1-bedroom private senior living community for as low as $1,500, $1,600 a month, all the way up to, say, $3,000 a month. Once we start getting into care or assisted living, now we're looking somewhere in the range of $3,500 to $6,000 a month. And there are even higher than that, so for some very high-end assisted living. So it can add up, but that's why you want to do your search and your tours so you can get the proper quotations and see exactly what you get.
Okay, well, that certainly helps us get a baseline anyways. Given that, are there any government subsidies that help offset any of these costs?
Yeah, the answer actually is yes.
Can
you believe it? The provincial government is actually subsidizing private senior living communities. So for once tax dollars that you've been spending your whole life, you might get a little back. So nice and simple, if you are over 70 years old, the provincial government will provide a tax subsidy. It works out to about 10 to 15% of the monthly rent. So I'll just use a straight figure, say $3,000 a month. The provincial government will give every month somewhere in the range of $300 to $400 It's literally a deposit into your bank account, and it's retro to $1. The government has said, look, we recognize that the system is broken. There's no rooms in the public CHSLDs. There's no rooms in the hospitals. Let's help subsidize the private sector.
Well, perfect. I want to thank you, Matt, for making it so bite-sized, understandable, and clear for us. How do people listen? How do our listeners reach you if they need an elder care plan or if they need assistance to find out the right senior living community?
Yeah, well, thank you. And as you know, Corey, our services are actually free.
That's right.
We don't charge families for search and tours, as our revenue comes from all the residences in the form of a referral fee, very similar to the real estate industry. So really no obligation and no cost. So the best way probably is to simply look us up, go online, Lianas, Lianas, Senior Transition Support. You could look that up, or a simple phone call, 514-622-8074.
That's Matt Delvecchio from Lianas Senior Support Services and my co-host at Life Unrehearsed. Thanks so much, Matt, for giving us your expertise.
Well, no, thank you, Corey. And listen, we want to wish everyone a very happy holiday season. We're off next week, but we'll be back on December 31st with the New Year's Eve show to kick off 2023.
And I must say, on a bittersweet note, that this will be my last show with you. I want to thank CJAD, Matt Delvecchio, and all of you, the listeners out there, for riding this wave with me for the last 5 years. It's hard to believe. It's been a privilege and a pleasure.
Corey, a pleasure indeed, an absolute pleasure. It has been a wild ride over these past 5 years. I'm really going to miss you, and I want to thank you for all you do. I don't know what our listeners, what goes on behind the scenes just to put on our little 1 hour show, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm going to miss you. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Life Unrehearsed. Many thanks to our technical producer, Marco Campagna, and you can listen to Life Unrehearsed here on CJD 800 every Saturday at 3 p.m.